She wore the crown for 70 years, held a nation through wars, scandals and storms, but she never told anyone about the son. Not Parliament, not her own family, not even the man himself. Until he turned 66. That's when a royal guard saw something he was never meant to see. A name. A sealed birth record from 1958. A son, hidden by silence, buried by the crown. And when he brought it to Prince William, the monarchy had to choose, keep hiding, or finally confess. Before we show you the moment Edward Hale learned his mother was the Queen, make sure you're subscribed with the bell icon turned on, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, because what you're about to witness was never meant to be part of history. But the guard made sure it was. Buckingham Palace had a rhythm. It wasn't loud or visible, but for those who stood guard long enough, that rhythm became instinct. Sergeant Alistair Greaves knew it better than most. He stood alone at the east quadrant of the marble hall, rifle by his side, ceremonial uniform perfect, down to the fold of his gloves. 22 years with the Coldstream Guards, veteran of Helmand Province, fluent in silence. And his peripheral vision, trained through hostile patrols where movement meant survival, caught something unusual just past midnight. A figure. Not a guest, not a senior royal, an aide. Moving quickly, too quickly. He passed through the Queen's gallery, carrying a leather-bound document case, one of the old transport satchels, reserved for high confidential files. But what stopped Greaves wasn't the speed, it was the seal embossed on the flap. Not the royal cipher used under Charles, it was older, a stylized ER. Elizabeth Regina, almost faded into the leather. A style not used since the late Queen's early reign in the 1950s. Greaves's eyes narrowed. No announcement had gone out about archival transfers, and the wing the aide was heading toward, the North Library Annex, was sealed for renovation. His instincts kicked in. This wasn't protocol drift. This was unauthorized movement of a file that hadn't seen daylight in decades. Greaves rotated his post slightly, subtle enough to avoid attention, but enough to position himself near the corridor junction. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then the aide reappeared, empty-handed, jacket smoother than before. Greaves exhaled once, then turned toward the annex. He wouldn't take anything. He wouldn't interfere. But he had seen enough in his life to know the weight of buried truths. And something in his bones told him that whatever had been brought into that room hadn't come back out. He waited until the corridor cleared. Then, silent as the stone beneath his boots, he crossed the threshold. The North Library Annex smelled of binding glue and time. Greaves stepped lightly across old parquet floor. The far desk looked undisturbed, but the chair was misaligned by 2 inches and the left drawer was locked. He reached for the upper right drawer and pulled it open gently. A brown leather folio, aged, hand-stitched. And there, the seal. ER. In gold, faded but unmistakable. He didn't open it, not at first. He simply stared, noting the way the leather cracked slightly at the corners, the way the flap creased as if it had been closed 1,000 times too many. Greaves knew the rules. Guards were not to read Crown documents, especially those not assigned to them. But this wasn't idle curiosity, this was instinct. An instinct had kept him alive in places where rule books meant nothing. He pulled the folder toward him, opened it carefully, and scanned the first sheet. Subject: Edward Montfort, Private Heir Inquiry, 1959. He blinked. The name meant nothing, not among royals, not in palace registry. No Montfort had ever been in line for succession. He flipped to the next page. Contingency Placement, Wardship, Redirection to Foreign Office, 1960. Typed on royal stationery. Signed not by a royal, but by Sir John Ashbury, Elizabeth's first private secretary. Then another sheet. Sealed birth record, December 1958. Mother, Elizabeth A. Father, redacted. Greaves's hand froze. His pulse kicked once, hard, like a rifle firing beside his ear. He closed the folder slowly, deliberately, the way you close a door you know you're not supposed to open. This wasn't diplomatic correspondence. It wasn't policy. It was a hidden bloodline, one that didn't appear in any history book, any televised biography, any royal archive open to the press. A son, not an affair, not rumour. An official, documented child, sealed and buried. Greaves placed the folder back exactly as he'd found it, adjusted the drawer, straightened the chair. He left no trace. But his mind was already racing, cycling through what this meant, what it could mean, what it would mean if anyone else found it first. He couldn't prove it, not yet. But if what he'd just seen was real, if the late Queen had a son the world never knew about, then someone had just unearthed a time bomb. And Sergeant Alistair Greaves had just read the countdown. He walked the corridor back toward the guards' quarters with his jaw locked tight. On the outside, composed. Inside, the weight of what he'd seen pressed like a pack too heavy to carry. He sat on the edge of his bunk, uniform still fastened to the collar, gloves folded beside him. He stared at the far wall, where a faded portrait of Elizabeth still hung. Was it treason to say nothing, or treason to speak? He thought of the late Queen. He'd stood watch over her in Windsor, during storms that cut power for hours. He'd lined the Mall during her final procession, rain pouring into his eyes. Could she have hidden a child? He wanted to dismiss it as forgery, but the paper had been too exact, the cipher too authentic. Sir John Ashbury's signature wasn't something you forged easily. Protocol whispered, "Report it up the chain." But a palace aide would bury it. A secretary would burn it. Even Charles was known for silence when silence was easier than scandal. It had to go to someone clean, someone who embodied the future, not the past. Prince William. Greaves exhaled, the decision hardening in him, like cement poured and set. He would risk it. He would request a private audience, something a guard never did. He would break centuries of silence, because silence, in this case, was betrayal. He knew the cost. The request itself could end his career. They could strip him of rank, send him into early retirement, dismiss him as unfit or unstable or worse, delusional. But the alternative, to stand still and watch the crown conceal blood, it had no right to erase. He tightened his jaw, undid the top button of his tunic, and leaned back against the bunk. Sleep would not come. Duty rarely let it. But somewhere in the dark, the decision was already made. By morning, he would set the wheels in motion, and whatever happened after that, his silence would no longer be an option. Requesting an audience with a senior royal was not just unusual for a Coldstream Guard, it was nearly unthinkable. The process wasn't written down anywhere, but everyone knew the unwritten rules. Guards were to be seen, not heard. They stood, they protected, they obeyed. But on the morning after his discovery, Sergeant Alistair Greaves did what no one had done in recent memory. He bypassed his commanding officer and submitted a handwritten note to the Royal Household Liaison Office. 7 words, nothing more. Requesting private audience, matter, Crown preservation. Sergeant A. Greaves, Coldstream Regiment. He expected silence, maybe a reprimand, possibly a quiet reassignment to some distant post where questions wouldn't follow. What he did not expect was the response that arrived just 3 hours later, delivered by a junior steward who looked like he'd been told not to make eye contact. "His Royal Highness will see you at 1800. Greaves arrived early, in full ceremonial dress, boots polished to mirror sheen. The steward who escorted him into Clarence House did not make conversation, just opened the doors to a private study and left without a word. Prince William stood near the window, sleeves rolled just above the wrist, no tie, no press entourage. Just a man in the weightless quiet of monarchy, watching dusk settle over St. James's Park like a blanket being pulled across the city. Sergeant Greaves. His voice was cordial but measured, the kind of tone that doesn't invite familiarity. "I'm told this is unusual." Greaves stood at attention. "It is, sir. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't." William motioned to a single chair across from the desk. "Speak freely." Greaves didn't sit. He remained standing, shoulders squared. "Last night, I intercepted movement of a document sealed under your grandmother's cipher. The aide who carried it deposited it in a locked drawer of the North Annex. I viewed it, briefly, sir." William raised an eyebrow. You broke protocol. Yes, sir. No excuse. Just fact. And? Greaves took a breath. The file concerns an individual by the name of Edward Montfort, dated 1959. It contains sealed birth record. The mother is listed as Elizabeth A. The silence in the room became physical. Not just the absence of sound, but something heavier, like the air itself had thickened. William stared at him. You're suggesting my grandmother had another child. I'm not suggesting, sir. I'm reporting. Where is the file now? Still in the drawer. I left it untouched. But the seal, the binding, the signatory, Sir John Ashbury's name was on the correspondence. I recognise it. William paced a few steps, fingers steepled his lips, eyes narrowing as he processed. And you told no one else? No, sir. I came directly to you. Why? Greaves's voice was steady, unwavering. Because your record is clean. And because the monarchy's strength lies in the truth it's willing to carry, not just the pageantry it performs. That stopped William mid-step. He looked at Greaves differently now, not as a soldier, but as something more dangerous, a witness. William finally nodded, slow and deliberate. You'll say nothing of this. Not to your commander, not to your fellow guards, not to anyone. But you will remain available. I may call on you again. Yes, sir. You've already put your career at risk. Why not go further? Greaves didn't blink. Because the crown may rest on silence, sir, but it survives on truth. And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving behind a prince who, for the first time in years, didn't feel entirely sure of the ground beneath him. 3 days passed. Sergeant Alistair Greaves remained at his post, saying nothing. No word had come from Clarence House, no summons, no follow-up, and for all he knew, the matter had been buried as quietly as the file that started it. Then, without warning, a page in formal livery appeared just before evening drill, a single envelope, gold trim, no insignia. Inside, a note in Prince William's own hand, 080 Quo, South Terrace Conservatory, bring no one, say nothing. Greaves arrived on the dot. The conservatory was closed to the public, its glass panes fogged by early morning dew. The doors opened silently, and there stood not only Prince William, but Princess Anne. She turned as he entered, expression unreadable. You're the soldier with the stomach to read what others won't. Greaves didn't answer. He didn't need to. William nodded to him. What you brought forward, my aunt had heard before, fragment, whispers. We're trying to trace whether they were rumour or something more. Anne stepped forward, voice low and clipped. There was a woman once, Lady Morwenna Hyde, a court attendant to your grandmother in the late 50s. She disappeared suddenly, resigned for medical leave and was never seen at court again. The rumours said she'd been sent away and that she'd taken something with her. Greaves remained silent, absorbing the implications. Anne studied him. What you saw, did the file mention her? Greaves thought back. No name, only the notation. Wardship redirected via Foreign Office, 1960. William stepped to the window, looking out at the bare trees. If this is true, it changes everything. Not for the line of succession, but for the crown's integrity. Anne folded her arms. There's no protocol for this, William. No rule book that says how to confirm a ghost in the bloodline. William turned to Greaves. You said you left the file untouched. Yes, sir. But you remember the name. Edward Montfort. William paced, boots clicking softly against tile. If he's alive, he's in his 60s. And if he's real, he's been living with this silence his entire life. Anne's voice cut in. So the question becomes, do we bury it again, or do we find him? Greaves finally spoke. I can look, quietly, without alerting the wrong eyes. William raised an eyebrow. You're a guardsman, not an investigator. Greaves didn't blink. I've spent years reading enemy intent from a quarter-mile away through smoke and dust. I can follow a trail. Anne nodded. He's right. If this becomes official, it spirals. Staff talk. Press smells blood. We can't risk exposure. William hesitated only a moment longer, eyes locked on Greaves as if measuring the weight he was about to place on him. Find him. Confirm what we're dealing with. Greaves gave a single nod. Yes, sir. As he turned to go, Anne said one more thing. If this is real, the House of Windsor owes someone an apology 70 years late. And just like that, the search for the Queen's secret son began, not with a royal decree or an MI5 briefing, but with a Coldstream guard in polished boots and silence in his step, walking back into the shadows to chase history. The palace didn't have a department for this. There was no button to press when one needed to trace a forgotten heir, no official workflow for unearthing a secret that had been deliberately buried beneath 7 decades of silence. But Sergeant Alistair Greaves didn't need a department. He needed discipline and time. He began with the Royal Navy. If the file was correct, Edward Montfort would have been born in late 1958. That made him roughly 66 years old now, prime age for military service during the Cold War. And while aristocrats often joined ceremonial regiments, hidden children would have been placed somewhere less visible, somewhere practical, somewhere they could disappear into routine. He pulled threads quietly, cross-referencing naval officer commissions from the 1970s, focusing on those who had entered under partial scholarship or with unspecified benefactors. The kind of vague language used when someone wanted to fund something without being named. One name emerged. Edward Hale, Lieutenant Commander, retired. No press history, no family tree, but listed in old Ministry of Defence records as having received an unmarked bursary linked to a trust registered under a shell holding with ties to, curiously, the Duchy of Lancaster. Greaves followed the trail the way he used to follow footprints in Afghan dust. Slow, patient, certain. The trust dissolved in 1981, just after Hale turned 23, the age at which most Crown-linked disbursements ended. From there, Edward's life faded into normalcy. Naval retirement. A modest teaching job at a maritime academy. A simple flat on the outskirts of Dorset, far from palaces and press and protocol. But one piece stood out. His original birth certificate, filed in a restricted borough hospital, had been sealed under government order. Unsealed only briefly for the Naval Commission Board, then resealed again immediately after. Greaves called in a favour from an old friend, now working clerical rotation at the National Archives. No digital request, no paper trail, just a quiet visit over tea in a back office no one paid attention to. When the file was placed in front of him, Greaves didn't even open it at first, he just read the label. Name, Edward Montfort, born 27th of December 1958. Mother, Elizabeth A. Father, redacted. Placement, Wardsborough Cottage, under Foreign Office guardianship, 1960 to 1997. No scandal, no inheritance. Just a boy shuffled off the board, hidden in plain sight, raised by strangers, protected by silence. Greaves sat still. The pages opened before him in the quiet of the reading room, the hum of fluorescent lights above. The faint rustle of other researchers somewhere down the hall. Edward Montfort hadn't asked for a title. He hadn't claimed the crown. He hadn't written memoirs or given interviews or hired lawyers to force recognition. He had simply existed, a son erased by necessity, raised by proxy, protected by silence that was supposed to last forever. Greaves returned to the palace with his notes memorized. No copies, no scans. Only the name, the face from an old naval photo he'd found. The quiet rhythm of a life hidden by design. He reported directly to Prince William. His name now is Edward Hale, Greaves said. Lives alone, retired, never married, no public claims. But the paper trail's real, and it ends with your grandmother. William absorbed this in silence, staring at the far wall as though seeing through it into the past. Then, does he know who he is? Greaves paused. I think he's always suspected. William turned toward the window, hands clasped behind his back. Then it's time we confirmed it for him. The invitation wasn't printed on royal stationery. It came as a handwritten note, slipped into a plain white envelope and delivered by courier to a small coastal flat in Dorset. The letter contained no crest, no signature, just a simple message typed on unmarked paper. Mr. Hale, There are matters of personal history that require a conversation. Please meet us Thursday, 14 at the address enclosed. Transportation will be arranged. Edward Hale almost didn't go. He had lived a quiet life. Naval service, teaching, books, walks by the sea, where the wind tasted like salt and memory. He had long ago stopped wondering about the strange gaps in his past, the sealed records, the occasional scholarship deposit that arrived without explanation, the way certain officials always seemed to know more about him than they should. But something in him, something old and unfinished, told him this was different. So he went. The meeting took place not at the palace, but at Birkhall, a secluded estate in Scotland, favoured for its privacy and distance from prying eyes. When Edward stepped from the car, flanked by a single uniformed staffer who said nothing, he found 3 people waiting on the gravel drive: Prince William, Princess Anne, and the man who had found him, Sergeant Alastair Greaves. No press, no fanfare, just the wind moving through pine trees and the weight of something long buried stirring to the surface. Edward entered the small drawing room without hesitation. He didn't bow, he didn't look nervous. Just observant, like a man watching history rearrange itself around him and trying to understand where he fit. William offered a nod. "Mr. Hale, thank you for coming." Edward sat. His voice was quiet but grounded, the kind of calm that comes from decades of not expecting answers. "I suspect I already know why." Anne studied him carefully, her expression sharp but not unkind. "How long have you suspected?" Edward looked between them, hands resting flat on his knees. "Since I was a boy. I was raised by good people. But they weren't me blood, and no one ever told me where I came from. I'd ask questions, and they'd go silent, too silent. Silence is its own kind of answer." Greaves stood in the corner, watchful as ever, saying nothing. But something in his posture softened, just slightly, as Edward spoke. William opened a leather folder, not the original, but a clean transcript of what had been found. He slid it across the table to Edward without ceremony. Inside was the birth record, the wardship order, a faded photo of a newborn child swaddled in royal linen, face barely visible beneath the blanket. Edward read it in silence. His fingers didn't shake. His posture didn't change, but something in his eyes softened, the tension of a lifetime finally loosening, like a knot that had been pulled too tight for too long. Anne broke the silence. "Your mother was 28, already queen. The crown couldn't afford scandal. The decision wasn't made by her alone, but she signed off on it." Edward nodded once, slow and deliberate. "I never wanted a throne, just the truth." William folded his hands. "You'll never be paraded. You'll never face the press, but your name will be entered into the royal archive, quietly, permanently." Edward looked down at the photo again, tracing the edge with one finger. "That's all I ever wanted." And in that small, unremarkable room, far from the eyes of the world, a son the monarchy never acknowledged was finally seen. The private meeting in Scotland had closed a chapter, but back in London, another one had just begun. Within 48 hours of Edward Hale's quiet departure, a closed-door session was arranged inside Buckingham Palace. No staff, no stewards, no aides with clipboards or courtiers with questions. Only 4 people were permitted entry: King Charles, Princess Anne, Prince William, and Sergeant Alastair Greaves. They met in the King's private writing room, a space older than most monarchs, lined with wood so dark it absorbed the light. The Crown did not hold such meetings lightly, but this wasn't a ceremonial matter. This was bloodline, legacy, correction. Charles stood at the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't turn when the others entered, just stared into the unlit hearth as though the answers might be hiding there in the cold ash. William was the first to speak. "We've found him." Silence. Then Charles turned slowly. Like a man carrying weight he hadn't expected to lift. His face was drawn, not with age but with recognition. Anne didn't wait. "His name is Edward Hale, retired naval officer, lives modestly, no title, no ambitions, but he is her son." Charles closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling through his nose. "I remember the whispers, back when I was still young enough to be shielded from the truth. A name I was told never to ask about, a file that was moved, then sealed forever. William stepped forward. He never sought the crown. He doesn't want attention. But the record exists, and we've seen it. He deserves acknowledgement, quietly, formally, with dignity. Charles looked at him sharply. Do you understand what that does to perception, to stability? Anne interjected, voice flat and unyielding. Perception is already cracked. You don't fix a fracture by layering paint. You brace it with truth. Charles paced once, then stopped in front of Greaves. And you brought this to light? Greaves stood at attention. Yes, Your Majesty. Why? Because the crown should not fear what it hides more than what it reveals. Charles exhaled, long and slow, like air leaving a tyre that's been punctured. You risked everything, for a name no one remembers. Greaves didn't flinch. He remembers, sir, and that's enough. A long silence settled over the room, the kind that feels like winter arriving through the floorboards. Then Charles moved to the desk, pulled open a drawer, and withdrew a single parchment folder, already prepared, as if he'd known this moment was coming. I've had the archivists ready this, a lineage supplement, unnumbered, outside the succession, but within the house. He placed it on the desk, looked to William. If we do this, it doesn't become a coronation. It becomes a confession. William's voice was steady, unshaken. Then let history read it that way. Charles lowered himself into the chair, pen already in hand. Very well. Let the record show that Edward Montfort, known as Edward Hale, was born of Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor, and acknowledged today by her son, he signed. No anthem played, no trumpet sounded. But for the first time in 70 years, the silence inside the palace was no longer hiding something. It was honouring it. The room chosen for the entry ceremony was not the throne room, nor the picture gallery, nor the gilded antechambers that lined the ceremonial wing. It was the Chamber of Records, hidden behind a panelled corridor beneath the grand staircase, a quiet space where royal charters were signed, archived and stored out of sight. No press, no heralds, just 4 people and a single document. Edward Hale arrived alone. He wore a simple navy jacket, freshly pressed, with a white shirt underneath. No medals, no ribbons, no uniform. A man prepared not for spectacle, but for closure. He entered the chamber slowly, eyes adjusting to the golden lamplight that spilled across old wood and stone. At the far end of the long table sat King Charles, face weary but resolute. On his right, Princess Anne, her hands folded tightly in front of her. To the left, Prince William, posture upright, expression unreadable, and standing behind them, perfectly still in full ceremonial dress, Sergeant Alastair Greaves. Greaves did not move as Edward approached, but their eyes met, just once, and in that second, everything passed between them. The search, the silence, the revelation neither of them had expected to carry. A royal clerk stepped forward, holding a slim folder bound in burgundy ribbon. His voice was flat but final, the kind of tone that doesn't invite questions. The following record is to be sealed under Section 7 of the Royal Archives Act, to be held permanently within the non-succession lineage annex. The folder was placed before the king. Charles opened it, read the final paragraph one more time, then signed with a silver pen bearing his insignia. The document read simply, Edward Montfort, known as Edward Hale, born 27th December 958 to Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor, shall be formally recognised as direct bloodline within the House of Windsor, without entitlement to succession, but with full acknowledgement of heritage. No title, no power, just history corrected. The clerk handed the pen to Edward. He paused, then signed beneath the king's name. His signature was steady, deliberate, the kind of handwriting that comes from a life spent writing reports no one would read, but that still had to be precise. I never wanted to disrupt anything, he said softly, eyes scanning no one and everyone at once. I didn't ask to be remembered, but I didn't want to be erased either. Charles nodded. You won't be, William added more quietly. Your existence doesn't weaken the crown, it clarifies it. Anne looked toward Greaves. None of this would have come to light without the guard. Edward turned toward him, studying the man who had chased a name through archives and silence. Why did you chase this? You didn't even know me. Greaves didn't blink. Because sometimes the truth isn't about who wants it, it's about who deserves it. Edward nodded, slow and final, as though that answer had settled something in him that nothing else could. The signing was done. Camilla did not attend. Her absence was not remarked upon, but it lingered, a subtle symbol of the fractures this truth had caused, the ways the crown had split between those who wanted clarity and those who preferred comfort. Greaves walked beside Edward as they exited the chamber together. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. But as the doors shut behind them, the crown, for all its shadows and ceremony, stood one step closer to honesty. And somewhere in the archives, a file that had been hidden for 70 years finally rested where it belonged. Not in shadow, in record. Should the monarchy have revealed the Queen's secret son to the world, or kept his existence hidden to preserve stability? And do you believe Edward Montfort, or Edward Hale, as he's lived, should have been given a royal title? Or was quiet recognition enough? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If you believe the truth should never stay buried, hit the like button right now. And if you want to follow every revelation behind palace walls, make sure you're subscribed with the bell icon turned on. Share this video with someone who still thinks royal guards only stand and salute. Because sometimes they're the only ones carrying the truth. Another revelation is already waiting. Watch it now, and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, right here on Guard Patrol. Sometimes the most important battles are fought in silence.